Greetings, this is Bruce Ruby with another part of Isaac Asimov's short stories. Now we're looking at the May 1942 issue of Super Science Stories. Well, in common with the one with the astounding we just looked at that had Time Pussy, Isaac Asimov's name is not found on the cover anywhere, not even in this ripped off section. I found a picture of the whole cover, it's not there. And not even in the table of contents. And this time, though, the reason is somewhat similar, except there is a name here. And therein hangs a tale, indeed. Probably one of the most unusual stories. More interesting, I have to say, than the story itself, though that too has some interesting aspects. This story that he wrote was presumed lost. Back in his very earliest days, when he had just written a story called Ring Around the Sun, the very next story he wrote was one titled The Weapon. And so it says, the next three stories, The Weapon and two others, took not 1 month as had the previous three, but 3 months. This is still 1938 that he's writing these. He's 18 years old. Okay, it was already written. Cosmic Corkscrew That's Lost, The Clisted Menace, originally a Stowaway, Marooned Off Vesta. Another one I think is called This Irrational Planet, Lost, and Ring Around the Sun. And he'd managed to crank those out in fairly short order in 1938, or at least once he was done with Cosmic Corkscrew. So now, the next three stories took about a month apiece, and all were clearly well below the limits of saleability, even in the most permissive market. They were The Weapon, this is the one of interest, and Paths of Destiny, which is now lost, and Gnosis and Glory, which is also lost. Campbell rejected each one in very short order, and all made the rounds without luck. There came a time, nearly 3 years later, when Astonishing seemed interested in The Weapon, but that fell through, and the other two didn't even come that close. All three stories are now gone forever. I remember nothing at all about 2 of them, but Gnosis and Glory was an ambitious attempt. He talks about Gnosis and Glory. So, in putting together the early Asimov, it was presumed lost. However, digging through his diary in much more detail, in preparing his first volume of his autobiography, Memory at Green, he discovered that The Weapon of those 3 stories had in fact been published after all. But something had happened. It had gotten published under a pseudonym. That was not something he'd agreed to. George E. Dale, he agreed to that pseudonym. In this case, the pseudonym just basically took his name off a story that was his, but still printed it anyway. He doesn't say whether he got paid for it or not. I'm sure the amount wouldn't have been very much even if he did, but if he didn't get paid for it, then that was definitely a wrong thing. Now, we're talking early 1942. Fred Pohl was no longer the editor of either Super Science Story or Astonishing Stories. He had departed from that in the middle of 1941. Now we're looking at early 1942. So it wasn't under with Fred Pohl, who I'm sure, even if he were to change the title, would not have changed the author. So, what's kind of unusual is that, therefore, it is the one story that, if you want a contemporary printing of the story, you get this Enjoy in Memory at Green biography volume, and it actually contains the text of the weapon, now finally at last properly under his own name. It's just a few pages, and that's about it. I found one very, very tiny change at the very, very end, and it just has to do with fixing what basically amounts to a small typo. In the original, he had to, our main character had to take something, and the alien said, had said, "It had not been given you. You have taken it." And the grammar wasn't quite right. It looked funny to me, and I compared it and fixed it here. It says, "It has not been given you. You have taken it." Other than that, the texts appear to be identical. So what exactly do we have of this, and where did it show up? Therein hangs the tale. So now we look at the table of contents, and we know the story is called The Weapon, and sure enough, that's what it's called, Super Science Stories, and it's right here where my finger is, The Weapon, and by H.B. Ogden? H.B. Ogden. H.B. Ogden, page 115. It has a little squib here, and it says, "We have the weapon that will save you, Earthman, but we dare not defy the law of the universe. Every civilization must work out its own destiny." Okay, well, let's take a look at the story. And of course, when you have the original publication of the story, although you don't have the author's name, you do at least have something that you don't get in In Memory at Green. And that would be, as always, the publishing blurbs, which is the table of contents I just read. Another one on the page here, and the artwork. Let's take a look at this artwork. It's actually kind of neat. There's this cat-like creature. This is what the Martian is supposed to look like. And there's the Earthmen, and they're talking. There they are. The Weapon by H.B. Ogden once again. And there's a small squib. I'll read the squib. It's not in Joyce, still in Memory at Green. It says, You ask of us Mars, for a weapon to save your world. We have it, but it is not for you, Earthmen. Men may die and planets perish, but we break not the law of the universe. Every civilization must work out its own destiny. So, there it is. It goes for a few pages. Just simple, normal pulp print weapon. And there it all is. So what happens in this story? Well, you're meeting up with these Martians, not at all like the Martians you would see there. And who is this guy? He has an interesting name, Preston Calvin. Is he related to Susan Calvin? Interesting thought. Since that fell into obscurity, I think that may be, although he never credits it anywhere, unconsciously one of the sources of the idea of maybe using Calvin as the name of her character. He described somewhere he was going to call her something else, and kind of similar, and then for some reason they decided that wouldn't work. How about if he used the name Calvin, perhaps not realizing or remembering that he had used the name Calvin in this obviously quickly buried and forgotten story. So, anyway, Preston Calvin, he's an Earthman coming to these Martians that are these cat-like beings, as you saw in the picture, and he wants to help Earth. He needs to save democracy. This is written in about 1938, even though World War II hasn't really quite started, not in Europe yet anyway. Actually, it was going on in between China and Japan. Japan was really picking on China in those days, but it hadn't really spread to Europe yet. But at any rate, it was about to go on, and Hitler was already becoming this spreading menace. Countries were making these peace treaties with him that they should never have made. Anyway, so he was getting understandably concerned. He has this rather bizarre, vivid idea of the last bits of freedom remaining on the American western seaboard. Well, that hasn't held out too well. That's no great citadel of freedom today, but the other parts might be somewhat more so, and nowadays even some other countries, sad to say. But at any rate, freedom limps on, and he's worried. He wants to save, democracy for humanity, save the world for humanity's sake. And the Martians apparently have followed their events, even with interest, but they have this absolute. It's kind of like the Prime Directive. We can't interfere with that. You have to do your own stuff. But it's not totally the same as the Prime Directive, because he's told he can't get it. They're not going to give it to him, not even to save democracy, which they may even appreciate or respect, but they won't do that. They won't give anything to him. And so he decides to steal it. And a rather interesting series of events occurs that he can steal it. Apparently, they keep their library of all this neat information on Dymos. He's afraid there might be a screen, that's like a force field screen around Dymos. He has a rather neat stratagem to test that without risking himself. He has a little lifeboat pod. I guess his ship came with a couple of them, and he just drops one down to the surface. Gravity is so low it can just fall down without any harm, as long as it doesn't bump into any force field, and it doesn't. I assume it recovers it, though it doesn't say that. So that was kind of a neat little bit. So having found that it's safe to land, he lands. He has to struggle with the low gravity. Then there's this bit about a rest period. He hears a couple of Martians saying one to the other, and the secret door that one walks into. He goes in there and he explores around, and all this exploring around eventually leads to he finds the chemical, which ends up being an isotope of bromine of all silly things. But okay. So he's looking for that weapon, and then the lights are turned back on, and the Martian is there and says, "So, oh great, we caught you." He says, "Well, don't worry about it. This is all part of you making your own destiny." Now we get to that line. It has not been given to you. We were not going to give it to you, but you have taken it. Go in peace. Kind of a neat twist. So, and an interesting kind of a culture, like I said, in a way that sort of prefigures like the Prime Directive in Star Trek, except if somebody successfully takes something, you just respect that they did, and that's part of that culture making itself. I guess if somebody finds a phaser or a communicator or something and keeps it, and then they use that as a basis of science or something, that's considered acceptable. This is a little different. So these aliens definitely have an interesting value system. It's kind of a shame we don't get to see more of it. That's all there is to the story. So it's not a bad little story. But why did it have to appear under the pseudonym of H.B. Ogden? I find a curious irony that these pseudonyms, as physically meeting the public in the printed form, are literally back to back. George E. Dale's Time Pussy story comes out, a matter of days before H.B. Ogden's The Weapon. So they're both kind of short stories, and again, I think it's a much better read than Time Pussy. I'll give it that. But it's not terribly interesting. Well, the story is not. It's pretty much told you. You don't mind spoilers. So it's kind of fun how he words it all, and I think it's still worth seeing if you can get a copy of it. Anyway, that's The Weapon, and I thank you for listening.